Okay, welcome again. I'll just say this, if you've met anyone new, the meetings are recorded, so do keep your video on if you would like that. If not, that's also okay. These, all of these happy hours will be in our YouTube channel as well. Automatically muted, but do use the chat to participate and ask questions. I am Giulia, the CADAF team, and today we are joined by Doreen A. Rios, an independent curator, but she's also chief curator of the Center for Digital Culture in Mexico City, and she's the founder of Anti-Material, a digital platform dedicated to the research and exhibition of Latin American digital art. And co-moderating with me today is Kleine Samson, who is the founder of Loading Net Art Festival. So thank you both for being here with us. We really appreciate it, and we really look forward, Doreen, to hear more about the topic of tonight. It's super interesting, hybrid spaces and soft material. So without further ado, can I pass it on to you? And
yes, of course.
Hearing a presentation, what you brought with us.
Well, first of all, thank you.
Understanding what soft material is, by the way. So
it's a lovely term, I think. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Carolina, for inviting me to join these events. I think they are absolutely brilliant, and thank you everyone for joining the conversation today. Hopefully it's going to be something interesting for you. And yes, at any moment, if you feel like, you know, sharing any thoughts, questions, if you want me to go further into detail about anything, just let me know on the chat and I'm happy to do that. So yeah, let's get started then. I'm gonna share my screen then, if I can. I think, yeah, I need permission to do that. Okay, brilliant.
yes,
Yeah, I'm ready.
you can now.
All right, so let me just make this a little, yeah, there it is. All right, so yeah, today I'm gonna be talking about hybrid spaces and soft materials and how they manifest on the internet. These, let's say this topic as a whole, altogether with the notion of new materialities, has been part of my research for the past 3 years. So I've been trying to, you know, develop further into understanding what happens with the materialities that deal with digital processes, but then also how they manifest in different spaces. In this case, I am particularly interested in talking about hybrid spaces, which means they have a physical component and a digital component, since I think that's going to be, let's say, like the key role of thinking about curatorial processes, well, nowadays, but also in the near future, especially after all that's been going on for the past months, right? So I'm going to start by making a small note about new materialities. I am very much aware that there are different researchers that approach this topic from different areas, but for this talk, I'm going to be talking about this notion about how the token material entity of current textual theory, just to go backtrack a bit, the 60s in France was the great period of virtualization. Everything became text. The materiality of the digital has been transformed as technologies developed over the past decades, which led to recognizing the way in which we approach, understand, experience, exhibit, share its outcomes. So when we talk about new materiality, sometimes we talk about also building new ways of understanding affection and of understanding interactions. But for this matter, I think that we have to take into account, of course, everything that deals with online spaces and digital processes, since they are very much embedded in our daily lives. So let's say new materialities as a whole, it doesn't really mean that we are trying to create or understand something that didn't happen before, let's say in terms of, you know, chemistry and physics, rather than the new ways in which we can exchange and collaborate and think about ourselves and about the way in which we create affections through different devices that are now part of our daily lives. So I'm going to be basically talking about two core areas of these new materialities. Then again, of course, there are a lot of other people and researchers who are talking about other sorts of new materialities. However, I think that when we are approaching, especially art creation or creative processes, these two areas are the ones that I think are the ones that are much more compelling on one hand, but then on the other hand, also the ones that are being explored further, or they're having explored further for the past, I don't know, probably 3 decades at least, when we talk about, you know, the history of the internet. So for the first one, I'm going to be talking about hypermaterials, which is a term coined by Bernard Stiegler in 2009 in his book, Economy of Hypermaterial and Psychopower. And it is a term that refers to the processes of exchange between digitization and materialization of an object, for example, in design and architecture, linked to the use of CADAF technologies and its reproducibility. The notion of hypermaterial ties to an aesthetic condition of acknowledging, recognizing the tools behind the production of an object or artwork as part of the language embedded in its final form. By this, I mean that sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this happen before, I'm pretty sure that you have. When you see something that has been developed within a digital environment and then eventually becomes rematerialized into something else, you can still recognize parts of its digital process embedded into the final shape. So by this, I mean, for instance, when you see, I don't know, like a flyer on the street, and if you work, let's say, within visual design or graphic design, you would be able to acknowledge and recognize certain processes that could have been part of the creation of said final outcome. So let's say when you see something and you think about how this was done, or we can see that also happening in social media when you see, for instance, someone that uploads a selfie as a profile picture and you immediately recognize the filter that they are using and where does this filter belong to. So let's say within all of the ways in which we interact with online platforms and online tools, we are more and more able to acknowledge and recognize that certain processes are embedded within certain outcomes, even though we don't see these outcomes happening within the platform they were created on. So I think that is something that happens a lot with, then again, with filters. When you see, for instance, like, I don't know, like the doggy face filter or a bunny face filter, and you're like, okay, so this filter, you might be able to recognize whether it belongs to Instagram or Snapchat or any other app that might not be one of these first two. And this process of acknowledging and recognizing these aesthetical patterns on the final outcome of, let's say, either a digital or a physical object allows us to understand a process a little bit more than we were able to recognize before. So for instance, when we talk about tools and we talk about digital processes, I would say that these hypermaterials belong to a cycle that could start anywhere between the object in its physical form, the digitization of the object, and the rematerialization of the object. So you could start in any point of this cycle. However, you would be able to recognize any area of these three parts of the materialization, rematerialization, and digitization of the process. So, of course, this sounds a bit complicated when I explain it like that, but for this, I brought an example, which I think is very interesting because it also talks about what happens when something becomes digitized, or what happens when we upload something online, and how does this distribute online or translate into other areas of sharing with others. I think I have something on the chat, but I cannot see it. So if anyone can help me read, if there's any question, that would be fantastic. I will keep going with the presentation. So what we see over here, this image right here, this is an artwork by Julieta Gil. This artwork is called Nuestra Victoria. It's an artwork that she created in 2019, so last year. And this particular piece right here is a 3D object. It's that was created through a photogrammetry process in which what she did is that she went and created a very detailed, very very strong dialogue with a political episode in Mexico City's history, which was last year's protests against gender violence. So last year, we had in Mexico City a series of different protests regarding gender violence that resulted in a lot of monuments, especially on the main streets in Mexico City, being, well, painted with different quotes and with different, symbols of protest and of showing resistance against well, gender violence that happens in Mexico. So of course, and I mean, I think this is something that has been going on in other places as well, but there was a conversation, a very, very strong conversation about whether this was the best way to manifest someone's unconformity regarding a topic. So of course, this is something that can be quite controversial. However, in Mexico, it is very common that whenever you have a protest this big and whenever you have, this sort of manifestation of not being okay with a situation that is ongoing, well, the government is very, very eager to just go on and say like, yeah, you can protest, but then again, tomorrow everything's gonna look fine, like they're gonna send teams to go and restore everything that got painted in order to erase the memory of said event. That's something that is very common. So Julieta thought, this is something that that definitely needs to be rethought and talked about more, because it is not possible that, when you have such a situation like the one we have in Mexico regarding gender violence, that's something that this could just go on and disappear from one day to the other. So one day you have a protest and then on the other, well, it is like as if nothing happened. So what she did is that she went at night after the protests to one of the key monuments in Mexico City that's called Ángel de la Independencia, which is the Independence Day symbol, which is actually, so it looks like an angel, but the actual name of it's Victoria Alada. So like the victory with wings, that's the name of the monument. And it's actually a woman. So the woman is the symbol of the independence in Mexico. So this monument in particular was one of the ones that got painted with graffitis and this sort of thing. And people were very pissed off because of that. But before it got removed, Julieta went over and did all of this photogrammetry process in order to keep it the way it was before being restored. And then eventually created this 3D model that we see over here that kept every single texture of what happened on the day of the protests. And then she uploaded that and released it online. Eventually, then she started showing these in other shapes and formats. So we can see that she showed it as in two screens as a rotating 3D model, but then she also printed parts of it in different, I think most of this is ink on paper, but probably it's also on cloth as well. So we can see this process of how we have something that is evidently material, which in this case is the monument in itself, the monument with everything and all of the textures and everything that got painted into it, a process of digitizing this physical object, which is the 3D model that we see here, and then eventually a rematerialization of this 3D model on different physical outputs, which is all these prints on paper and on cloth, and then also presenting these within two screens, that have, a specific scale and shape and size and, all of these physical, tangible characteristics of being confronted with the screen. So what we see over here is that, yes, on one hand, we see this whole process of a physical object being digitized and then rematerialized on something. And then within this, how this can expand through different platforms. But then also we have a very strong discourse regarding why this got digitized in the first place. So of course, in this case, it has a lot to do with resisting a form of power, which in this case is of course the dominant one, but then also one that allows for erasing a memory, erasing an event from the collective thinking or from the collective memories. So what she did with this is that once this got released online and she shared it around as a 3D model that anyone can download and do whatever they want with it, what she's doing is that by viralizing these through the web, this soft material, which we'll be talking about in a bit, can transform, mutate, and become anything that, that the one that has this file wants it to become. So yes, of course, on one hand, it might be losing, let's say, part of the conversation about this specific protest in Mexico City, but then again, it's gonna be explored in different areas of thinking as well. That it's not gonna be restrained to a physical format. So, yeah, I think I have to. How do I unmute you? Let me see. Okay. There it is, Giulia.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yes, sorry.
No, I'm trying to be like, I cannot unmute myself. Thank you. I don't want to, yeah, there was a question. So before you go into new materials, let me know what
Yes.
do you want me to go back to the question on hyperreality, or would you like?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Because, well, more than a question was like a comment from Paul, which I will read it out. So hyperreality seems similar to Flusser's concept of techno-image, language embedded in image, essential to image, and later of virtuality put forward by Margaret Morse or N.K. Hales.
Yes, definitely. And I think, you know, it feels very similar and it feels very close also because of the notion of expanding set materials or of expanding set realities instead of replacing or putting in front of the other, you know, a different, let's say, environment to it. It's a way of expanding the notion of what we understand as, of course, of real, but then also of what we can manipulate, transform, and share. So yes, definitely. Thank you, Paul.
I am also going to put in the chat the link to Julieta's website.
Yes. Yes, I think Giulia has brilliant work. And it's also the kind of artwork that is always flowing within this hyper-material realm, I would say. So I think, you know, by trying to explore also these possible outcomes and these ways of understanding how this whole artwork becomes and it's put together, because of course we cannot say that the artwork is only the 3D model, and we cannot only say that the artwork is the prints that got, you know, that existed afterwards. She created this 3D model. Is the whole experience, or the whole parts, or the whole bits of these conversation that we're having that create these artworks. So yes, on one hand, it's a situation that happened within, you know, the political story in Mexico City, but then also is this 3D artwork, and then also is all of these prints, and then also it could potentially be anything that people who download this 3D model and reshape it do with it. So I think in that sense, the notion of expansion and the notion of the hyper material becomes, let's say, or creates a sense into it and into this cycle of the materialization, digitization, and rematerialization of a process. And the second new materiality that I'd like to talk about is new materials, which is actually very, very similar to the hypermaterials. But in this case, Well, this concept is proposed by Christian Paul, and she uses this to describe those objects that incorporate digital technologies and embed, process, and reflect the data entered and or reveal their own encoded materiality and the way in which digital processes see our world. So this is not only about, let's say, expanding or creating a case for building a wider net of what this material can become, but then also it explores the way in which these processes of materializing something or rematerializing something or digitizing something also add into the conversation of what's going on within, within this artwork or within this object, let's say, in a broader sense. So it's not only about how and why we create a digitized version of something or rematerialize a digital object, but it also deals with what gets lost or what is gained within these processes. Because of course we cannot talk about, let's say, a clear, transparent transaction of digitizing something. There's always something that gets lost or that is gained within this process of rematerializing or digitizing something. So within the new materialities or the new materials, they are very much interested in making visible these parts that get lost or that get gained, that are gained within these processes. And the example that I'm going to be using for this is an artwork by Arjan Guerrero. This is an artwork that's called Zero Grammar Case 2088, which is a series of pieces that engage within a very specific narrative that I think is a very beautiful way of understanding what is processed, embedded, and gained and lost within these digitization processes. This particular artwork right here is, it's a story. So by its core, it is a fiction story where an archaeologist of the future comes back to Earth and discovers one of the first Xerox machines for copying, and that is called KYO, so he names it Kyo. And he discovers this like on an abandoned building, and he brings that machine back with him. And since in 2088, apparently we are very much connected to machines and we can just have conversations of any type with them. This archaeologist tries to create a conversation with Kyo. But of course, Kyo is on one hand, a very old machine that don't necessarily tries to communicate back to humans, but then also it is a photocopy machine, right? So what he starts doing is that he starts creating this conversation with Kyo, or he tries to create this conversation with Kyo by photocopying the same blank page over and over until, of course, the machine starts creating certain patterns that are not necessarily a language, but that he thinks is a language. So he starts by asking Kyo, do you copy? Which I think is a fantastic question for a photocopy machine. So yeah, he starts asking Kyo, do you copy? And starts copying the same blank page over and over and over and over and over until he starts seeing these patterns that we see on the books over here. These are actually part of this whole process. So by this, by creating this or by having a look at these patterns that are created with these, by photocopying the same quote, Kyo, do you copy, over and over and over and over until it disappears. Afterwards, he realizes within this fiction that actually, yes, Kyo wants to say something, but he still doesn't know how to talk that language. So he uses an AI system to create patterns to see if Kyo is actually talking back to him. This is an actual process that the artist made, even if it is within this fiction. So he started working with a series of engineers that helped him create the patterns, which is the small video that we see below. And with these patterns, he started creating an alphabet, and this alphabet starts eventually becoming a conversation with Kyo. So this is a very, 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 very long process of how this work of fiction, by putting, actually by activating that in real, let's say in a real scenario where he actually uses this photocopy machine and actually asks and photocopies the same quote over and over and over, he creates this experimental language of this machine that doesn't have a digital process embedded into it, to create a digital process that is, of course, fictional, in order for him to be able to communicate with Kyo. So this is a very, very extensive artwork. It's, well, the amount of work put into place in here, I think is just brilliant. But then again, what we can see over here when we talk about these new materialities is that even though this machine in itself, it is not a digital machine, and it doesn't communicate, let's say, through this series of embedded encoded languages as we would understand them within the digital world, he puts that and creates a fictional language for it, a fictional digital language for it, for him to be able to understand what this machine is saying. So, of course, these books that are over here are meant to be all of the stories that Kyo tells him and that he is still not able to decode. So I think it is interesting because what he's talking about is showing, like literally showing all of these encoded processes that, even though this one doesn't really belong to any, let's say, real or actual machine, if we will, he's still able to create this exchange and conversation by revealing its encoded materiality, or the encoded way in which we would understand each other by interacting with a machine. So let's say, of course, on one hand, we still have these, let's say, this cycle of what is material, what becomes digitized, and what becomes rematerialized. And what we see in these exchanges is that it's exactly where he's placing his fiction. Because let's say we could understand that the machine in itself, the physical machine, the physical photocopy machine, is the physical bit to it. And then all of the process of understanding the language, or the fictional language of this machine, is the digitization process. And then he rematerializes all that, and it takes the shape of these books, and it takes the shape of these final format videos where he shows his process. But the artwork in itself is actually situated in the fiction of what becomes, or what happens within this translation of the physical machine, the digital language that he creates for this machine, and trying to understand back this language that is in his head, talking or trying to communicate back to him. So within this process, we can see that, let's say, let's see, if we compare this to what happens with Giulia's artwork. Giulia's artwork is not, let's say, it's not embedded, or in a way, it's not situated in these translations between the physical, the digital, and the rematerialization. It is in every bit of the digitization and the rematerialization. But with Arjan's artwork, the conversation is actually within these jumps. What happens within these processes? The fiction becomes important for these ways of understanding how he puts together all of these story of trying to communicate with this machine. So in that sense, we could say that within this cycle of materialization, digitization, and rematerialization, the hypermaterials are very much interested in the key areas of this process. Well, let's say, and on the other hand, the neomaterials are very much interested in the process in between, jumping from one to the other. So that's, like, let's say, the key difference between one and the other. So with this, well, if there's any question or comment or anything, do let me know. If not, we can go into how these, say, creates a case for talking about soft materials. So, of course, I mean, the notion of soft materials, it is very much tied to the ideas behind the soft tools by Marisa Olson, who also speaks a lot about soft power and software, and why using the prefix soft by talking about soft tools. And I took a couple of quotes from one of her articles one chapter in particular that's called The Rhetoric of Soft Tools, which I think it's very interesting and very compelling to understand what goes on within these processes, where she says, what about those tools that are objects and vice versa? What about those artifacts that are not only de facto encapsulations of their conditions of production and consumption on a most basic level, but that also comment critically on network condition and other factors of making, which is something that we can definitely see happening when we talk about hypermaterials and neomaterials. This critically commenting about why should we choose one or the other? How can we move in between these processes of digitization, materialization, and rematerialization? And she proposes the term soft tools as devices without the physical force of the cycle and hammer, which are not less effective in their ability to create objects soft or hard. Quite simply, consider the meaning of the prefix soft in the word software. Well, she's talking about soft tools and talking about how certain tools, even though they do not have these, let's say, physical force or materiality that can be shaped necessarily in the traditional way, these soft tools can also become the objects in themselves. And she uses this to talk a lot about, for example, software art. So what happens with software art? She expands a lot with the conversation about how, yes, on one hand, the software in software art is the art, but then also every single outcome of this software is also the art. So the tool becomes the object and the object becomes also the tool. So we cannot separate them. It's part of the same process. So when we think about, for instance, software art, in the cases of, let's say, Friedrich or George Nice, that's let's say like the key part of on how they are creating and understanding all of these processes. But they becomes, let's say, a soft tool, in the words of Marisa Olson, when it can become both. It is both. It is the tool, but it is also the outcome, and we cannot separate them on any given case. So we can see that happening again, yes, within software art, but then also with, for example, bot making, or any generative process for that matter. So yes, every single outcome is an important bit to it, but then also it is the tool that carries the discourse of these artworks, or of these creations, let's say, generally speaking. In this case, well, expanding in Olson's notions of tool, I propose to think about soft materials as those which can be transformed and or are in a constant state of transformation. So if we go a little bit back on how this ties also with the idea of soft power, for example, when we have, let's say, in this broader sense of understanding what is hard power and what is soft power. Hard power is all of the, let's say, all of the power-made decisions in order to enforce an ideology, a law, or whatever we want. And this hard force normally deals with physically approaching or physically interacting or intervening within a given situation. When we talk about soft power, we talk about how, yes, all of these changes or shapes in ideology or and how to enforce a law become part of, say, a softer way of approaching this, but probably a much more compelling one, which deals with how can we shape this ideology through other means of consumption. Particularly, this can be tied to propaganda, of course. This can be tied to the ways in which we consume and see things online as well. So when we start having this conversation about, for instance, what happened with Cambridge Analytica and Brexit, or Cambridge Analytica and Donald Trump, everything that was enforced in there, or most of the things that were enforced in there, were soft power, which doesn't mean it's not as compelling as hard power. It's just something that we are sometimes not able to recognize or to see at first. So that's why it becomes much more dangerous if we talk about it in that sense, because it's something that it's always there, and it is a layer that we need to decode in order to understand that exists. So when we're talking about software, and when we're talking about the internet, and when we're talking about these soft tools, if we put together all of these conversation about, yes, soft power, soft tools, and then software in itself, we need to be able to understand that all of these soft tools that eventually become soft materials will almost always have to transitate with this layer, through this layer of soft power that is navigating the internet in 2020, right? Because the way in which we consume the internet in 2020 is basically through social media. And social media, of course, enforces this soft power through the ideologies of whoever is behind these platforms, or any given internet service that we are using for that matter. So when we talk about soft materials, or my proposal when we talk about soft materials is that, yes, we're talking about this series of tools that are also objects that cannot be separated from one another, but then also we need to consider this layer of soft power that is always, yes, transforming them, but then also reshaping the conversation that is being had in between these materials. And what we see over here is an artwork by Fabiola Larios. I think her artwork in particular has always felt that it goes back and forth from within the screen, outside the screen, and the ways in which these interact with her body. And I think one of the, let's say, most compelling ways in which we can see these soft materials manifesting outside of the screen is when they reshape or become part of our bodies outside of the screen. And which in this case, for instance, all of the artwork of Fabiola has a layer of how everything that she has consumed online has shaped or reshaped the way in which she understands herself, her identity, and her body, and her relationship with others. So always tied to this soft power, and then always tied to the ways in which we go back and forth, let's say, within these bubbles of hypermaterials or neomaterials. And just to finish off, just to rethink a little bit about the things that I've been working on in my own work, but then also the things that I think we need to reconsider when we have once we have had this conversation about these new materialities and these soft materials and how they can manifest online. I created this small diagram over here, which I've called the symptoms of curatorial resignification. And in this sense, the things that I propose that need to be reconceptualized are the notions that we have towards authenticity, distribution, automation, preservation, the art market, and authorship. When we talk about these soft materials and the layer of soft power that lies on top of them, we have to consider that not only we're not talking about the traditional ways in which we would approach the notions of any of these concepts, but then also that we have to understand how we translate that into the curatorial practice if we want to show this on any given space, because this will allow us to think where, how, and when this kind of artwork could be manifested, whether that be online or offline or a hybrid of both. Normally, these symptoms of curatorial resignification, as presented here, I would approach them by making myself these questions about the artwork that I'm dealing with, which of course has a lot to do with rethinking the exhibition space and also rethinking how this can be presented online. So normally I would start by asking myself, how should the artworks be experienced, whether these be individually, collectively, in pairs, in a specific group, or any other way of being experienced? What type of interface do you require in order to experience the artworks? What is the ideal atmosphere to surround it? Is it outside, inside, within a given event, in a specific area? What is the extension of the artwork? Does it exceed the interface? What material links does it have? What is its ideal scale? And what actions must be taken to access the artworks? These are probably the questions that I ask myself within any artwork or any exhibition that I'm working on, because I think this allows us to reconceptualize what we've seen in here. Once we start, in a way, working out these questions, which is the sort of questions that, let's say, probably within other ways of production are already established or are already, let's say, put into, let's say, groups of ways of how we understand to approach certain artwork and what we can do or what we cannot do. I think that when we're talking about especially new materialities, we have to understand these questions first and then make a decision on whether these should or how these should be presented or manifested on the internet or outside the internet. I think something that we sometimes we don't really think much about is the extension of the artwork and whether if this artwork exceeds the interface or not, and the material links that it has. Especially when working with let's say, screen-based artwork, I would say that this extension of the artwork, sometimes it is hard to measure. But when we think about placing something online, I think it's normally the conversation that we have. It normally exceeds the artwork. How does this exceed the artwork? By, for instance, being shared on different platforms, by being, I don't know, like having a lot of the screen captures of people that then afterwards post this elsewhere, or by people who share this video, or people who are talking about whatever artwork that is manifested online outside the screen as well, or that this is broadly shown not only for one person but for a collective through, I don't know, a screening or this sort of ways of exceeding these interfaces. And then again, when we think about these hybrid spaces, we are normally always manifesting within these this hybridization. Is the way in which we understand, I would say, our bodies nowadays. It is not either one or the other. Is again like this cycle of going inside the screen, outside the screen, and sharing in both, and conversating and talking about it within these areas, within these both, let's say, spaces of exchange. And what is the ideal scale? I think that is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I think it might sound, I don't know, like a bit strange at times, but when we think about screen-based artworks, I don't think that we regularly think much about how they should be seen. We only try to, make them work for either desktop or mobile phone. But the thing is that there are a lot of things that should be able to be seen in different scales and formats. And I think that when we think about, these processes of materialization, digitization, and rematerialization, and we ask ourselves these sort of questions, we are able to expand into the conversation on how to create positive bridges and to actually create a proper space for these formats and these soft materials to be manifesting online. So yeah, that's me. That's all from my side, but I'm happy to keep on talking a little bit about this. Yes.
I think I just wanted to, clap, exactly. I just wanted to give it to Carolina to maybe if she had any questions that she wanted to ask you, but I think you might have to unmute her as well. Thank you so much.
Yes.
For this. For me, again, I keep saying that I'm sort of relatively new to the digital art world, having come from a brick and mortar side of the artwork anyway. So it's every time it's a learning curve. So amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to.
But she's gonna mute you soon. Well, I was gonna ask you also what were from your thoughts about challenges for curators in the digital realm, but I think you sort of answered that in your last slide. All of the things that you have to think about and all of the things to consider in a way, in a different approach. So I'm not going to ask you this anymore. I'm going to pass the baton on to Carolina.
Thank you very much, Doreen, for the talk. It was amazing. And I have a question. It's more like, if you have any advice for artists that work with traditional media to explore like the digital art or the new materialities. Yeah, if you have like any advice to switch or to explore this new.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I think on one hand, like what now more than ever, we cannot think really, without thinking about digital process tied to it, whether that be, even just sharing your work online, even if that's, very, very traditional painting or sculpture or whatever. I think the conversation is not necessarily that distant. And of course, I'm very sure that anyone who is working in 2020 on any given form of creation is already talking a little bit or a lot about what goes on within these digital spaces. So I think it's just a case of understanding which bit of it, of these digital formats or processes interest you, whether that be from just talking about what goes on online, or the ways in which we explore our bodies, or what happens, let's say now that we are, well, in Mexico, we're still in lockdown. So, what has been going on with ourselves and with our bodies by being only or mostly connected through screens. I think, the conversation is already there. It's just a case of exploring further into what are the things that might be interesting for them to understand within their own practices. And it doesn't necessarily mean, creating digital work, and it doesn't necessarily mean putting their work online. It probably only means understanding the ways in which we interact with these other materials that are available out there. And maybe that's where you would understand where to or how to expand your artwork through the screen. So for instance, I think about another Mexican artist. Her name is Beatriz Krill. I'm gonna look for her website to share it with you on the chat. She's a painter. She's a painter, and she discovered Mozilla Hubs recently. And she has had like a series of studio visits where she's sharing her paintings through these online guided tours through Mozilla Hubs. I mean, she's still painting, and she's still, she's still very much into working with other sorts of materials. But then again, she found the space online to do something that she was not available to do at the moment with her own practice, which is, I cannot have studio visits because I cannot have anyone coming over. But then again, I can put that on, Mozilla Hubs and invite some people to join and still be able to talk about my work and still be able to share with them what I'm working on. Even though if it's just the representation of the work and not the work in itself, which I'm very much aware of. But, in times like these, sometimes having these sort of exchanges and possibilities creates also a way of building new conversations. So
yeah, I think like it's a good way to
Sorry,
Giulia.
just to let you know, we have 2 questions also from the audience. So
I want to finish with the idea, for example, like I think this is a good way to think like our environment, like or our digital environment, like a landscape, right? To create more than more than think about digital of the tools or like devices. I think it's like more like something that inspire us to create, right? Something like that. That's
yeah, and I mean, just to finish off on that idea, I think that what I'm interested on about digital practices is definitely not the tools in itself. I am not interested in something that goes on, by someone who thinks that the best way to create something is to say, oh, I want to do a VR experience, or I want to do a net art piece. It's like, it's not about that. It's not about what you want to say. It's about the ideas behind this. It's not about the tools. Digital tools are just another set of tools. We already have some, really interesting set of tools. This is just another set of tools that we can use to share certain, urgent topics or ideas or critical thinking, but it's not about the tool in itself.
Yeah,
It's about the content. So, yeah.
So
Okay.
Darcy was asking, she will love your thoughts on these. So are we selling artwork in a physical or non-physical format, or both? I was recently asked if I sell my VR artworks to collectors for the VR worlds. And then she also adds, is the role of the artist to make artworks to entertain the public for free? Are we the only ones who are not supposed to value out time in terms of financial compensation?
I think, yeah, definitely. With digital art, especially art that goes online, it is a very hard conversation towards how we understand the value of these formats. And once we understand the value, how can we share that through, you know, an economical logic that, yeah, allows us to be part of the art market. I wouldn't necessarily say that when you're selling something that is built or created to live digitally, that you have to necessarily sell something that is physical. Let's say, I understand, of course, that there are a lot of processes that are very easily commodified, and others that are very, very hard to understand outside of the screen. Like, what's the point of, let's say, selling a really beautiful USB drive when you are selling, I don't know, GIFs or videos or whatever. I think that first of all, we have to understand the ways in which we feel, or at least the way in which I understand the value of digital formats, which is very much the opposite of traditional tangible formats, right? So when you give value to something that doesn't live within a screen, normally you would give value to it because it is not as approachable, because you have just one copy of it or 5 copies of it. And that's the way in which you understand that something becomes more valuable. But when you put something online, something that exists specifically online becomes more valuable as it becomes more viral, if you will. I would say, or I would suggest that in a way, digital formats tend to be much more compelling or much more powerful if they are shared more, rather if there's only one person that can have access to this, or just a limited group of people that can have access to this. And on the way, I don't know, in this sense, I'm going to go back to her questions about whether we should be working for free. Of course not. I think that the ways in which we could understand this exchange of online economy, which is definitely not my area of research, but I'm going to try my best. I think that it's in the processes in which we give value to it. So yes, I think the artwork should be able to be accessed by a broader audience, but I think that whoever is placing that artwork or putting this artwork together or commissioning this artwork is the one that has to pay for it. So yes, not the ones that are going to let's say, in a way, consume this, or that are going to be part of the audience, but yes, the people who are commissioning it. And I think it is a difficult logic into it, I'd say, because normally we are, very eager to just go on and say like, oh, whoever gets access to this museum or whatever is the one that's gonna pay the price for it or pay an entry ticket for it. But I think in the internet, it's the other way around. The one that is putting this together, and that the one who is shaping this and developing this to put this online, is the one that should be able to, give value to this work. Because then again, it's not something that should be seen as something that has no economic value, because there's a lot of time that is put into it. So, yeah.
I agree. I think we have time for another sort of last question by Leon. I think it's an interesting one. Do you have any thoughts on the role that the digital gap plays on whether or not certain publics have access to these objects' experiences? Do institutions share responsibility in bridging this gap?
Of course. Yes, of course. In my experience working in Mexico City, of course, I'm very much aware of accessibility problems. Even within the digital culture center, sometimes we do not have like the latest devices or the best internet connection or this sort of thing. But what we do have the responsibility of doing, or at least that's how I feel as the curator of the center, is we should be able to give space and to share and to, in a way, try to bridge this conversation by, yes, allowing people to come over and share with us their thoughts, but then also by giving back through our education programs. So, for instance, just one of the main programs that we have is digital tools for elderly people. Normally, people would just come over on Thursdays and be like, you know what, I don't know how to share, my picture on Facebook, or I don't know how to install WhatsApp, or I don't know how to do this and that. And we would do is that we have a one-on-one session just to, answer questions and give feedback or help out with whatever thing they want to do. And I think that there's also a very, very, very nice conversation that goes in between that. So for instance, there was once this lady that came over and she was like, okay, so no one, like my granddaughters, they are not going to read my recipes in this very beautiful book that I've made for them. But what if I do a YouTube channel where I share with them how to cook, whatever family recipes we have. And we did that with her. And I think by doing this and by listening to specifically what's the concern about whatever thing regarding digital people might have, we can help give an answer and give back into it. But yeah, then again, that's the reason why I think the one who is behind, let's say in this case, the institution is the one that has to pay for it, but then allow for others to come over and join for free. So yeah, definitely it's part of this responsibility.
Thank you. Wow, I mean, there's a lot of comments and thoughts that are incredibly interesting on the chat. Well, you're probably reading this, but Valerie says, by talking about my own experience as digital artist since 1994, the only market I've found is the institutions and private foundations, but haven't conceived an agreement based on immaterial art inspired by Siegelaub, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, yes, I mean, absolutely. I think that, yes, of course, sadly, it is still something that I know that doesn't necessarily, it's not being understood in the values and formats that it has. If I am, I don't know, if I can give an example for this, I would say that there's this Mexican art gallery that's called Janet 40. And what they do is that they create limited editions of artworks with digital artists, and then they sell these limited versions on art fairs and these sort of art market spaces. What they do, and I think it's an interesting twist, is that they work a lot with this hypermaterial notion. And what they would do is that whatever they're selling to you is an edition of just having an access to the artwork. So sometimes they would sell, for instance, they had these sound artist that had, an empty MP3 file as an artwork. And what they did is that they created a towel, like an actual towel that you can, dry yourself with, that once it got wet, and then you could see a password on it. And then this password, you would put that in their website, and the website would allow you access to the MP3 file. So what they were selling is a towel, which is neither the representation of the artwork, nor the artwork in itself, nor it tries to replace the artwork. It's just the access to the artwork. So it is more the experience behind taking your towel home, having a shower, putting that on your body, seeing if you can see the password, writing the password, putting that online, and then listening to the song for the first time. They're selling that experience. So you could say that it is a very expensive towel or a very cheap artwork. So, you know, I think these kind of playful thing in between, not trying to sell the representation of the artwork, nor the artwork in a format that doesn't make sense, but the experience, but, you know, a different exchange, a different way of accessing something. And then again, you have a very beautiful towel that you can use whenever you want, right? So I think this sort of playful thing between creating an object, but not necessarily the object that wants to replace or represent the artwork, is probably one of the most compelling ways I've seen this happening for, you know, digital art to be part of the art market. So yeah, look them up. They have more things. Janet 40, I think they have a lot of solutions for that. And yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just thanking everyone also in the chat. So I will thank you everyone right now. I think it's time to wrap up, unfortunately. But also thank you everyone for their thoughts in the chat. For me, I've always learned a lot reading to all of you, adding comments and reflecting on whatever topic we're talking about. Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, Carolina, for your time. We should, you know, given the interest, we should make a part 2 later on. Back and continue this conversation, because this
I'd love to, yes.
And also we can talk a little bit more about also maybe Antimateria and the work that you're doing with that and supporting the digital art scene in Mexico and Latin America, which I think will be great. Okay, so Doreen, you're the host, so you're gonna have to end this.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
A round of applause, really. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you. And yes, if you look for Antimateria, anti-materia.org, you can see, you know, there's my contact over there, some texts, some exhibitions, and yeah, some other crazy things that I've been working on. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take
Bye.
care.
Take care.